Comparisons by nature are difficult, and there are many reasons why. One of the most common thing is that you of course are comparing different brands and go head to head with each other. And of course we're getting different results with them. And then preference really comes to play. But even when it's the same brand, it doesn't necessarily make the comparison any easier. Because, well, yes, these are the same brands, there is a clear change in hardware, with the main sensor now being a 35mm equivalent, making this comparison a little bit harder. This will mean that I'm cropping in on either the X100 Ultra to get the same focal length as the X200 Ultra, or I will be cropping in on the X200 Ultra to get the same focal length as the X100 Ultra. So let's begin with comparing the main sensor, and by the way, their native field of view is different. The X200 Ultra delivers a more compressed shot compared to of course the wider field of view on the X100 Ultra. This means subjects further in the background appear closer on the X200 Ultra. This isn't just a zoom, this is a shift in perspective, a change in the depth of the shot as well. When used thoughtfully, it definitely creates a more natural depth of field. This is why so many photography enthusiasts were genuinely excited about this update, including me. Especially since I've been using Nubia with that 35mm equivalent length as well. I find the tighter composition more pleasing. I always felt like that 23-24mm was simply too wide for stills. Looking at the shots side by side, you will also see that the processing on Zeiss Natural is a bit different now. But the colors are close to being the same most of the time, we can see some difference in the contrast. But also a slightly better control of light sources, even sometimes a decent amount better. That 23mm equivalent focal length, you can use the ultra wide on the Vivo X200 Ultra and then crop in. To help with this, Vivo included their largest ultra wide sensor to date on this phone. Still, let's be clear, the shots that I'm showing are going up against a native 1-inch 23mm equivalent sensor. That's a tough battle to win for any phone. And naturally, when comparing those focal lengths, the X200 Ultra doesn't win. But it holds up quite well if you don't start nitpicking details. Where the X200 Ultra really steps up is in that 35mm comparison. Now naturally, to do so, I need to be cropping in on the X100 Ultra just to match that focal length. And yes, the crop does impact the image itself. But even so, the X100 Ultra does hold up quite well. That said, when looking at the overall presentation, the colors, the rendering, the way that each shot feels, the X200 Ultra often feels more refined for me. when it comes to comparing different focal lengths, especially ones that are this different, there's a lot to keep an eye on. From the natural depth that each lens produces, to simply trying to keep things fair. And at the same time, answering the questions I know you would love to have an answer on. I know you wanted to see a 35 versus 35 comparison, and I know you also wanted to see the difference between the 23mm and the 23mm. Though I'll admit, in quite a few shots I did mistakenly treat it as a 24mm on the X200 Ultra. That naturally makes this bit of the comparison a little bit longer, but I also think it's important to answer those questions that you were looking for. This is kind of where I wrap it together when it comes to this main sensor comparison. The X100 Ultra and the X200 Ultra offer fundamentally different experiences when it comes to the shooting experience. So if you are using the X100 Ultra now and are wondering, should I upgrade just for the new main sensor? Well, it depends on what you are seeing in this comparison and if it fits your narrative. In my view, the drop of quality and depth feels more noticeable when you are comparing 23 versus 23mm. This means if you love to shoot on a 23mm equivalent, then I wouldn't necessarily say that you should get the X200 Ultra. Meanwhile, with the X100 Ultra, it holds up better with that 35mm versus the 35mm. Though there might be some other reasons why you would want to upgrade to the X200 Ultra, but we'll get to that later on. To be honest, what stands out the most for me in this comparison and the difference between the two is simply the processing. Its handling of the shadows and the use of the color contrast feels more alive. Not necessarily more accurate, but definitely more engaging, especially when we are talking about difficult colors like red. And that might be the biggest shift between these two. The difference of focal length really depends on whether you are shooting 23mm a lot or if you are using that 35mm equivalent a lot more. Now I said there might be another reason to upgrade to the X200 Ultra if you are using the X100 Ultra. But again, this truly depends on the kind of user that you are, and that comes down to the log video recording. The X100 Ultra supports up to 4K and 30 frames per second in log video recording and only on the main sensor. Jump over to the X200 Ultra and not only does it support up to 4K and 60 frames per second, which means you can slow down the footage, it is also supported on all sensors. For those who are wondering what log video recording is, it's basically footage without any color grading, giving you a wider dynamic range and of course retaining more details in the highlights and the shadows, making it easier for you to adjust the footage and make it fit your own preference. When looking at the Periscope lens, both devices use the same HP9 sensor at their core, but there's a subtle difference. The X200 Ultra now features a larger aperture, an f-stop of 2.3 versus a 2.7 on the X100 Ultra. That change, while small on paper, leads to brighter shot. It allows more of that natural depth of field, especially when used with that intention. Now for me personally, this Periscope was probably the one that I use most often on the X100 Ultra. Why? Simply because of the compression that it gives and the kind of composition that I can create with it. I naturally gravitated towards it. Especially when considering the X100 Ultra has that 24mm equivalent main sensor, the telephoto simply allowed me to get more of that composition that I like. That said, while the hardware differences are relatively minor, the experience feels a little bit different. The X200 Ultra tends to sharpen things up more, but beyond that it also retains a little bit more detail next to it. Together with that combination, it often leads to more cleaner and more defining results on the X200 Ultra. But there's something worth noting once again. we see a difference in the image processing, the same thing that we saw with the main sensor, especially with the way that the colors and the contrast are handled. The X200 Ultra leans slightly more to that tonal depth, allowing some shadows to fit in the scene itself, allowing because of that a bit more depth in the shot. There are moments where the X100 Ultra pulls ahead with that moodier contrast, but that's not a consistent pattern at all. That being said, you could also edit the shots and get really similar results. Now both are recording on the main camera, and you can see how much more the X200 Ultra is when it comes to that crop. 35mm equivalent simply does this to your video. If we go about the 1.5 times zoom, we can see this is then the result that you're getting on, of course, the X100 Ultra compared to the X200 Ultra. We'll also say the X100 Ultra is definitely a lot brighter. Now let's switch to that main sensor. You can see this is pretty much the same, but again both are quite bright. Now let's go main sensor and then 28mm, 24mm equivalent on the X200 Ultra, and this is naturally cropping in. So quality wise, the X100 Ultra will win in the 24mm equivalent when it comes to that sensor. Front facing camera on both, 4K 60 frames per second. They look very similar, slight color difference, but that's about it, I think. Not much else. Maybe a bit sharper on the X100 Ultra. 4K 60 frames per second on the main sensor for both. This is going to be hard to compare because, of course, different focus. Ultra wide for both. I would say the X100 Ultra is definitely representing the scene far less. It's not that bright. Yeah, the X200 is a little bit too yellow, too warm, but still. See, can I try to get to 23? 23 and 23, and then try to get 35. This one, so you can see a little bit of a difference. Right, Periscope. Vivo is hunting X100 Ultra. The light normally reveals quite a bit of noise. I thought I saw some on the X100 Ultra, but hard to say right now. Get back to the main for both, so 35 and 23mm. Front facing camera on both, 4K 60 frames per second. I like the contrast a little bit better on the X200, but my skin just looks a little bit odd. On the X100 Ultra, that's definitely better there. In the world of mobile photography, a lot of it is about computational photography, and this is where RAW files enter. RAW files are the untouched negatives in the purest form of the image itself, capturing just what the sensor sees. No filters, no heavy processing, just light, shadow, details and all that in its natural state. This allows you to have control over the end result, be it with the colors, the contrast or simply the mood that you wish to create, allowing that creative freedom, the image that you have in your head, to be the end result. Naturally, both the X100 Ultra and the X200 Ultra support this, but the X200 Ultra does support high resolution for all sensors, where the X100 Ultra doesn't support it for the ultra-wide sensor in the RAW format. Naturally, RAW files will be shared with my members, so do check them out yourself as well. Funny enough though, the lowest ISO the X200 Ultra can reach is 72, where on the X100 Ultra it's 50. Both have a max ISO of 12,800. Shutter speed can go all the way up to 32 seconds for both, but also all the way down to 1/12,000th of a second. Now, of course, RAW files are more than just your plain image, right? There's also a lot about details and information in the shot. And I will say that I've noticed something very different about the way that the X200 Ultra looks. And I would say when it comes to the Periscope, I actually prefer the X100 Ultra. Yes, the X100 Ultra definitely has more chromatic aberration around it, and there is something going on in the background itself to affect the image itself. But the X200 Ultra isn't faultless here either. There's something going on with the image itself when you really start cropping in on the image. Here, for instance, you can clearly see the amount of chromatic aberration going on. But again, with the X200 Ultra, there's a lot of weird artificial stuff going on the shot itself. I'm unsure what this is. I don't know if there's a term for it, but it looks really peculiar when you look at the shot side by side. Again, there is more information on the shot of the X200 Ultra, but there's just something odd going on with the shot itself. Now, of course, this is a real big zoom in, and you wouldn't necessarily notice this at all, but it's something that is worth mentioning. Macro photography. It's a gateway into the smaller worlds, the delicate patterns on a pedal to the mesmerizing details of insects. These things would go unnoticed, but through a macro lens, they come alive. Both the X200 Ultra and the X100 Ultra invite you into this miniature universe. Their macro modes are practically identical. Same zoom ranges, same quirks, and sometimes you need to zoom out just to get that lock on the focus. Then zoom back in just to get that frame right. Now, in terms of results, both deliver a slightly AI enhanced polishment, but truthfully they are not far apart in terms of that result. Where you do notice the difference is in the colors, the processing. While both can have nearly identical results when it comes to the image, but the X200 has a subtle shift, and it changes the mood somewhat of the shot. But realistically, when you have the X100 Ultra and you are looking to the X200 Ultra for macro photography, it isn't a huge switch between these two. It's just mostly the color difference between the two. Now let's talk about the ultra wide lens, and honestly it's my least used camera sensor. Maybe it's the focal length, but I just never feel like it clicks with me. Or maybe it's the quality that always lagged behind compared to the other lenses. But with the X200 Ultra, things somewhat changed. Their sensor size has been bumped up quite significantly. And yes, that's probably thanks to the absence of course, that 23mm equivalent lens. There's a noticeable improvement in terms of quality when it comes to the ultra wide. But when it comes down to looking at the image in full, I would say the biggest difference that you will notice once again is the difference in processing. That's the main thing you will really notice between these two. Yes, the quality has increased and you can definitely tell in the shots. But also the color profile is just slightly different compared to what we got on the X100 Ultra. Which basically means what I'm saying right here, rinse and repeat when it comes to all the other sensors. Portrait video is also a possibility, however it is limited to 1080p and 30 frames per second. But it does look quite natural, at least on my phone. Portrait video on the X100 Ultra also possible, however this is called cinematic portrait, so it's a little bit different and you will see colors quite different as well and saturation. Of course, if I change it to classic movie, it looks kind of similar to what you would get on the X100 Ultra with the cinematic one. But yeah, hopefully you can properly hear me though, because it is quite windy outside. At the end of this comparison, I will say that both of these are really good devices, especially when it comes to the camera and especially if you like the style that Vivo is going for. My personal preference matters way less here when it comes to that kind of situation. I'm very curious to know which one you would pick out of these two when it comes to the camera. Because of course a 35mm equivalent for me is really nice, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you want it. You might want that 1-inch 24mm equivalent. Either way, let me know what you think about this comparison and which out of these two you would pick when it comes to the camera performance. Either way, before we leave, I really want to thank my members. Thank you so much for the support. I really appreciate it. And of course, if you want to become a member, you can click join next to subscribe. And while you are there and aren't subscribed yet, don't forget to subscribe. This really helps out a channel like mine with the growth and subscribing and so on and watching the video in full. Either way, I do hope that you enjoyed this video and of course, talk to you guys in the next.